Tonight, we won't chase constellations or draw neat maps over oceans that refuse to stay still. Instead, we'll stand on a deck of slow-moving fog, where the horizon has forgotten which side belongs today. The ropes breathe, the gulls drift without purpose, and somewhere below the mist, a helmsman turns a small linen pouch in his palm. Inside it, a clear crystal waits, quiet, patient, and older than every compass combined. They say such stones could find the sun, even when the sun was hiding, that they could read the light behind the cloud, the way a heartbeat is felt through cloth. To most, it was only glass. To those who sailed blind, it was a promise, small, transparent, but certain. The sea trusted it. So did the hands that trembled slightly as they turned it, searching for the faint meeting of twin glows that marked true direction. So lower the lights. Let the fog breathe for you a while. And if your breathing begins to slow with the pulse of the tide against the hull, that's the ship remembering its way home. If quiet voyages like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next latitude will remember your name. And somewhere beyond the lamps, the night inhales again. The silence folds itself neatly, like linen put away for mourning, and for a moment, the whole city feels suspended between heartbeat and echo. Then, far off, something moves, too heavy for wind, too careful for man. A sound like sand brushing bronze drifts through the alleys. The air tastes faintly of metal, and the red light behind the clouds begins to throb like a thought that refuses to sleep. Every shutter, every bowl, every quiet pair of hands knows what it means. The goddess is near, walking, breathing, remembering what was taken from her. The stone has several names because useful things collect names the way wool collects burrs. Some call it a sunstone, which is straightforward and slightly optimistic. Others, with a tone that suggests laboratory benches and tidy shelves, say Iceland spar or calcite, or even a wanderer's glass, a phrase that carries its own small map. It travels wrapped in the same wool that protects the sailing board, and it shares a chest with a corded compass, a depth lead still wearing its chalky taste of the last shoal, and a spoon with a notch that tells whose spoon it is. The crystal is used at dusk and at dawn, and also in the flat glow that pretends to be afternoon at very high latitudes. When direction feels like a rumor and every wave insists it is a road, it is not the only sign, never the only sign. The helmsman counts the swell, listens for birds, watches the color of water shifting from slate to iron to the pale green of a bottle held to the light. He tests the wind on the inside of his wrist as if greeting a baby. The rule is modest. No single sign stands alone. A crystal can whisper, but it does not speak over the weather, and it certainly does not interrupt a gull. If you are wondering how a lump of transparent stone finds a star that has gone skulking behind clouds, it has to do with the way daylight is untidy. Even when the sun hides, the sky is full of lines you cannot see, threads of light arranged in neat polar patterns, like coned flax under a sheet. The crystal, being helpful in a very literal way, splits that light into twins, bright and pale, two answers to one question. Turn the stone slowly, and the twins slide past each other, a soft shuffle like pages of a book being coaxed into place. When the two are equally strong, the stone is aligned with the sun's secret axis, and a practiced hand can point a ship toward the sun without any sun at all. It is not magic. It is just order, with the pleasant side effect that order feels like grace when land is safely days away, and the cook has managed to stop the kettle from rattling. The science, in its indoor version, would say something about polarization and crystal lattice, which sounds like a very clean pantry where every jar has a label. The sea prefers the shorter explanation. Turn until the twins agree. Then keep going. Crews learn this as they learn everything else afloat, which is to say by repeating the smallest movement until it no longer feels like a movement at all. In winter, When snow brightens even the hours that are supposed to be night, the younger sailors practice on the afterdeck, turning the stone while the ship idles under a reefed sail. At dusk, they mark bearings on planks, tracing faint lines the color of tea. At daybreak, they check the angle with a shadow stick that is just a piece of spruce trimmed to a pencil point. Errors are logged with a kindness that has become traditional. A gust, a bit of ice in an eyelash, an eye too quick on a rolling deck. Skill grows where patience is stored. It is not dramatic. It is the way bread rises when you are not looking. Over time, the crystal stops being a novelty and becomes part of how the ship breathes. No one brags about it. The only pride comes from a page full of careful numbers and the calm way the keel writes a straight sentence across a confused sea. Some people argue over whether a tale mentioning a sunstone meant a tool like this or only a metaphor for someone who brought good weather in their pocket, the way a lucky person brings the first spring robin. Scholars note such arguments in tidy lines of a book, and sailors nod, because the debates sound familiar. Every crew has a friend who says the wind turned because he tightened his hood, and another who believes a clean deck shortens storms. Meanwhile, archaeologists find clear calcite among trade goods in places where otherwise you mostly find iron rivets. A piece of amber, a whetstone worn into a dark almond by habit. The finds look ordinary among the useful, which is, in a way, the best evidence that a thing was loved. The truth at sea hides inside tools, not triumphs. No one carves a monument to a crystal that prevented an error. They wrap it in wool, put it back, and go on. Skeptics have their place, like the ballast you never see but always carry. Clouds move, they say. Ships yaw, hands rush, crystals lie. These are all true statements when you treat them impatiently. Navigators answer with a routine so dull it could be a lullaby. Repeat the observation, cross-check with swell and wind, note the birds, record the sea's reply. If the sky gives you a hint, take it twice. Experiments ashore in windowless rooms where light is filtered until it behaves have mapped the sun through stubborn overcast with surprising, measurable accuracy. It turns out that skepticism and seamanship are cousins. Both say, do it again. Write it down, make sure it wasn't luck. The verdict curls comfortably at the edge of the logbook, plausible in practice. Legendary only in its restraint. It is the kind of conclusion you can set a cup on while you tie a lashing. The most agreeable part, if you like gentle rituals, is the watch change. Every time the bell says it is someone else's turn, the small dance begins. Lift, rotate, align. Confirm with the wake, replace. If two bearings disagree, the helmsman trusts the older line and waits until swell and wind consent to be consulted again. Patience is the real compass. The crystal is just the conversation starter. Sails trimmed by whispers, canvas adjusting in a way that makes the prow write a cleaner sentence across the water. The feel of the ship eases. A person who has never sailed might think this is all very abstract, but it is as practical as arranging the spoons in the galley so the cook can find them in the dark. The stone goes back to wool, still cool, like a kept promise or a mint at the end of an uneventful meal. If Sunstones truly rode out with Norse crews, and the evidence sits there with the calm expression of a bowl of porridge, then survival was their only boasting. Turning uncertainty into direction is a quietly glamorous act, the kind of glamour that wears boots and carries a coil of rope. A single crystal can take the edge off fear and turn it into task. Science can give the how with diagrams and arrows and a vocabulary you can embroider on a neat sampler. Seamanship gives the why, because a steady hand is kinder to the ship, because land is where people wait, because a story told later should be about smoke from the galley and not about wandering unnecessarily. Between the two, the sky opens a little. Even when it does not, the habit remains, and habits are what carry you through weather. If you have stayed awake this long, you have practiced a sailor's art already, repeating something simple until it becomes a path. There's a touch of humor in all this, very faint, like a smile under a beard gone stiff with salt. The stone that finds the sun does not shine. It does not glow. It does not hum. It does not ask for a shrine or a new verse in a song. It merely insists that even lost sunlight leaves fingerprints. The helmsman uses those fingerprints the way a baker reads the color of a crust, or a shepherd reads the angle of an A-way. Seer. If you want a modern comparison, consider the bars of a weak phone signal that somehow still know which way the tower lies, and how you hold the phone a little higher even though you doubt it matters. The gesture calms you into trying again. That is the Sunstone's main gift. It gives the hand something reasonable to do while the mind waits for the weather to remember its manners. By now the fog has thinned. Somewhere beyond the cloud there is a sun, the exact size of a coin you cannot spend, but you can still feel its weight in your pocket. The ship holds her sentence. The lines on the board look like neat stitches in a long hem. Someone coughs, someone turns over in a bunk, and the rope above the berth clicks softly against its hook like a shy metronome. The crystal is asleep in wool, and if a hand reaches for it in the dark on habit alone, it meets only cool glass, the kind of cool that settles the breath. No one announces success. No one would think to. Even the gulls take their time before remembering to complain. We drift toward the next check, the next small turn, the next pair of pale twins, who will, if asked, kindly tell where the sun is hiding. And if they do not, the ship will still listen to the swell and the birds and the color of the water in a cup. The night does not end, it simply keeps lowering its voice, and the course goes on drawing itself, a steady thread, across a cloth that is mostly gray and very generous. You might not think a horn that is only meant to be blown once would need this much polishing, and yet here we are with a soft cloth, a quiet hallway in the sky, and Heimdall turning the bell of Jallarhorn in the palm of his hand, like someone checking a cup for hairline cracks. He does not rush. His steps along the edge of the rainbow sound like someone moving furniture very carefully over a rug. At Himmelbjerg, the little house tucked where the bridge meets the clean air, the door is open the width of a thumb because he likes the way drafts file reports without being asked. The horn rests on a folded pelt when he isn't holding it. He checks it for dust that has no business being this high and for fingerprints that do not exist, because the bridge, like a museum on a Tuesday morning, receives visitors rarely and with rules written in tidy letters. If you're still awake after we finish the second pass with the cloth, you can subscribe or remember the idea of subscribing and put it gently down beside the mead jug. I promise I won't notice either way, and the horn certainly won't. His day is mostly night, and his night is mostly day, because the guard of the rainbow sleeps less than a bird and hears better than anyone with ears has a right to. The old sayings are precise about it. He can hear wool growing on his sheep and grass rising in the field, which is useful as a fact and soothing as a sound. He keeps charts for these things on thin boards hung on pegs above the hearth. On one board the lines are green, on another white, and in the corner he has written slow weather in small runes that look like someone whispering. From Himmelbjerg he can look both directions along Bifrost and see what the colors are thinking about. Some mornings the red is too eager and needs a word. Some evenings the violet has decided to be moody and hangs back as though late to a feast, which it is not because there are no feats on a bridge, except the quiet kind where light eats distance and nobody minds. He walks the span and checks the stones where it kisses the world, and the stones where it minds the sky, and while he is there, he dusts the posts, even though no one ever sees the posts. The dust is mostly theoretical. Still, he has a brush for it. Heimdall's senses have the polite thoroughness of a clerk who loves his shelves. He listens to the hum of the snowfields, to the small, clear ring of a frost edge forming on a spear far below, and once every long while he catches the delicate scuff of a raven's claw touching a roof beam in the city of the gods, which he files under feathers minor. When wind brings him the sea, he smiles in the direction of 9 distant mothers, because his beginnings were complicated in a way that never needs to be discussed at length, but deserves occasionally an acknowledgement at the doorway. He has 9, and he keeps them all, like someone with a generous number of aunties. There's mead in a cup, warm just enough to be persuasive. He sets a lid on it when the breeze grows nosy. People call him Golden Tooth, and indeed his smile keeps his secret shine like a coin kept clean by habit rather than pride. If any of this sounds glamorous, it isn't. It is maintenance, which is the quiet kind of magic the world prefers. Think of the security guard who swipes a badge through a sleepy scanner at 3 in the morning and straightens a picture frame, even though no one will look until 9. Heimdall is their patron in everything but name. There are routines you might like. He walks with a little box of small tools that are almost comically modest. There is a feather he uses to test the breadth of the bridge. There is a bone needle that lifts moss from between stones, though, to be honest, the moss is imaginary, and the needle is for the satisfaction of having a needle. There's a bit of chalk he uses to refresh a faint line on the milk pail railing where his hand naturally rests. The way some people redraw the path to the kettle, even though the kettle never moves. Most mornings begin with a slow inspection. He stands at the first arc and counts the visible villages by smoke color. Pale, then pearl, then the thin gray that means a baker woke too early and is thinking about it. He counts hoofbeats where the bridge meets the outskirts, not because anyone is coming, but because counting hoofbeats makes the bridge feel paid attention to. Numbers calm him. The bridge vibrates and says thank you. On days when the air behaves, he practices listening to very small things on purpose, the way a musician tunes by leaning toward a single string. He listens to the ice within a glacier rethinking itself. He listens to the dew decide which leaves to visit. He hears a spider at the far end of the span trying a new technique with silk, and he nods approval like a master craftsman who has never made a web but has excellent taste. If you wonder whether that level of hearing is restful, it would not be for everyone. Yet to him it is background music, a long, soft symphony written by things that do not know they're playing. He scores it casually in the margin of his charts with little runes that mean all is normal, and occasionally, note, thrush practicing near the cold birch by the third fence. Every few hours, he touches the mouth of the horn to check the temperature. He has a list that reads, very practically, good, cool to cheap, better, cool to lip, perfect, cool to thought. It is not an objective scale, but then neither are most important measurements, like almost asleep, or tea just right, or the exact distance between a hand and the thing it wants. Once in a soft, while he speaks to the bridge. Not aloud, this is not that sort of story, but in the language of habitual gestures. He tightens the little bronze tie on a cable of color, and the green brightens, pleased to be remembered. He smooths a wrinkle where red and gold overlap like the corners of a well-used prayer rug. He cleans a tiny drift of frost from the lip where the bridge dips toward the world, even though the frost has no plans to cross. He leaves small tokens at the places that like tokens, a bead of salt, a hair from his comb, a shred of wool snagged from a hook in the wall. When certain clouds pass, he makes a note of their gait. Cloud with large opinions. He writes without irony, and if you have ever watched weather walk across a valley, you know what he means. The bridge hears with him, not exactly, but in companionship, and together they make a careful arrangement of uneventful minutes. If there were a museum of safekeeping, the rainbow would be its refurbished gallery, and Heimdall its happiest docent. The horn, which has not been forgotten and cannot be, sits with the contented patience of an instrument that understands both purpose and delay. He oils the mouthpiece with a dab of something that once belonged to a seal and now serves posterity. He checks the seam, the curve, the balance, and the way a breath warms the throat. He does not practice the call because there is no call until there is only the call, and that is none of our business tonight. Instead, he practices breathing without sound. You can try it with him, in through a nose that knows weather from memory, out through a mouth that could move a mountain and chooses not to. He times himself by the length of one color, then another, then all. Sometimes he hums the pitch of quiet, which is unfairly underrated and matches almost any room. At Himmelbjerg, the housekeeping is consistent and faintly particular. The bed is made with a sheet that smells like sunshine and cold metal. The shelf for cups is organized by how much conversation each cup seems to want. The broom leans at exactly the angle that says, "I will work for you, but I will not chase you." He keeps a basket for small repairs, and in it a link of thread that is longer than it needs to be, for the pleasure of making it so. On the table lives a tidy list of people who might try the bridge without asking first. The list has 4 names written very small, and a 5th space that has been left blank for years, not in hope but in habit. When goals circle, he puts crumbs out on a saucer like a host who understands the power of negotiation. If the gulls forget, the crumbs become a private treaty with a fox who visits when the air colors itself in late evening. He has neighbors, if by neighbors you mean sounds that return often enough to earn a nod. There is the slow foot of Thor when weather walks, a step as domestic as it is loud. Heimdall registers it under friendly thunder, acceptable on weekends. There is Frigg's gentle clatter when spindles turn. He files the rhythm with the note, household important, do not interrupt even for beauty. There is Odin's deliberate quiet, which is a loud quiet, the way some silences have posture. Heimdall hears it with respect and keeps his own quiet smaller, so that both silences may sit side by side without crowding. Occasionally, distant laughter from the mead halls arrives like warm water running in the next room. He smiles and writes ordinary joy, and does nothing more, because ordinary joy, when it is elsewhere, is in excellent hands. Even on a day with nothing scheduled, Bifrost asks for little chores that make time fold itself neatly. Heimdall checks the slope where travelers sometimes imagine they can drop a pebble and watch it stop. Pebbles never stop. They learn manners and become part of the floor. He oils the hinge of the small gate at the far end where waves think about putting salt on everything, because waves are that sort of relative. He counts the steps from his threshold to the place where the wind first recognizes it is dealing with a bridge. It is always the same number, but counting it again pleases him and makes the bridge stand a touch straighter, like a spine adjusting to attention. He makes tea from leaves he keeps because someone once left them and because there is no rule against tea this high. It tastes faintly like moss considering a career change. From time to time, he holds the horn to the sky without raising it, the way you hold a book you are not yet ready to open. He lets the mouth of the horn fill with the idea of sound until the idea grows heavy and then lighter again. He notes that weight in his charts with a mark that has no spoken name and does not need one. He looks down over the edge and observes the stitched border where world meets bridge, and he straightens a stitch that doesn't actually exist with fingers that know how it would feel if it did. He looks up and considers the alignment of certain stars that are not part of his job description yet insist on saying hello. He says hello back with professional warmth. If anyone approaches, which seldom happens, the bridge tells him long before the foot touches the first color. He hears the conversation between boot leather and mind, the way travelers reassure themselves in their heads by instructing their feet. He listens to whether the courage is fresh or stale and chooses which part of the railing to lean on accordingly. Most travelers stop at the first glow, as if a sunrise were practicing under their shoes, and decide that some journeys are better as stories told at home. Heimdall nods in agreement and marks the event as prudence exercised, bridge pleased, horn asleep if a traveler commits to the second glow, He walks toward them with the unhurried confidence of someone meeting a guest who has already been fed. The conversation is gentle, often about shoes, sometimes about the weather as a person you must respect, never about anything you could not fit into a pocket and carry back without changing its shape. He admires good laces. He admires sensible baskets. He admires anyone who recognizes when a bridge is also a question. Evening is his favorite hour because it has several copies. The first evening trims the colors until they look like velvet with a purpose. The second pins a pinprick of star exactly where a raven would perch if a raven had a mind for balance beams. The third turns the air thin enough that his hearing can reach under it like a hand under a door, touching everything on the other side without moving it. He writes the temperature of each evening on a slate and adds whether the mead agreed. The horn's temperature, when touched to his cheek, is still on the cool to thought scale, which is perfect. He sits on the step and repairs a small snag in the weave of a mitten, even though he could knit an entire new mitten in the time it takes to correct a single loop. He prefers repair. It ranks high on his list of ways to tell the world you like it. Sometimes he considers his 9 mothers with the same fond patience he gives to the bridge. They were all waves, which explains why he knows what water is thinking when it tries to pretend it does not have moods. He names them one by one without speaking, a roll call the sea hears and answers with a sigh that tastes like fish and weather. He smiles in a way that shows a quiet coin of tooth, and returns to counting the frost grains on the railing, which settle into his tally like slow stars moving to their assigned chairs. He believes in assigned chairs. Hindenburg has a physical place for each tool, and the tools behave better because of it. The feather lives in a small tube. The bone needle rides in a corked jar with sand for company. The chalk sleeps in a pocket with a string. Jalahern has its folded pelt, and the pelt smells like contentment. A few hours past midnight, the world tries on its softest noise. He hears a single seed decide not to fall just yet. He hears the dream of a dog in a yard 2 realms down, the kind of friendly dog that makes a lot of work for its tail. He hears the idea of frost forming on a distant ship rope, then hears the captain throw another blanket on the coil and call it wisdom. He approves. He writes wisdom coil level in the margin and underlines it because he might use the phrase again. He sees in the far dark a hill that keeps alight for someone late. He records the light as excellent manners. He thinks about sleep the way a librarian thinks about a favorite book, fondly, but with a schedule. He will nap for the length of the green stripe to the first blue, which is not long, but is enough. He naps standing, like a horse with a diploma. Just before dawn, the bridge holds its breath. This is his favorite chore, because it looks like doing nothing. He stands at the center, horn under his arm, and waits for the smallest change the world can manage without effort. The change arrives as a weight shift, like a second slipper finding the floor. Color takes a polite step forward. The dew pretends it always meant to be there. A baker's smoke remembers it as time. He touches the horn to his cheek, then to his lip, then to thought, and enters the reading on his chart with a rune so faint it might be the shadow of a rune. If someday the horn must sound, he is prepared. But meanwhile, he tends it the way a gardener tends a gate, not because anyone will use it, but because good gates deserve friends. His friend tonight is a horn that gleams like an idea freshly remembered. The bridge looks pleased with itself. Hindenburg smells like clean ash and wool. The tea has learned to be lukewarm. The goals discuss nothing of consequence. If you are still listening, you have done exactly what he does. Counted the unimportant things until they realized they were comets in sensible shoes. The rainbow has walked itself into new light and does not need anyone to applaud. Heimdall sets the horn back on its folded pelt, writes "Ordinary Day Achieved" on the topmost board, and opens the door the width of a thumb, just as he found it. There will be another pass with a soft cloth soon. Not because the horn requires it, but because the gesture answers the sky's question before it is asked. He picks up the feather and lets it tell him a number. The number agrees with the bridge. The bridge agrees with the day. And the day, as always, agrees to begin by doing almost nothing at all. You might not expect that immortality, in the practical sense, smells faintly of clean linen and sliced apples left near an open window, but that is what the pantry of Asgard teaches anyone patient enough to look. In a corner where the light arrives as if it has already been polished, Icon keeps a small table that never wobbles, a box that never squeaks, and the kind of quiet that behaves like a well-trained pet. She is the custodian of apples that do not announce themselves. They sit there like coins that have decided to be fruit for a very long time. She turns one over in her palm and checks for the almost invisible line where day met night on its skin. Her thumb has learned the distance between enough and too much. On the shelf above, 3 claws wait, labeled in a handwriting even the Norns would call Mead. One is for dew, one for travel dust, and one for the idea of fingerprints. If you're still awake by the time we reach the 3rd cloth, you may subscribe or simply think warmly of the notion and let it drift past like a bee with a sense of direction. Either way, these apples will not take offense because they have never hurried anyone in their long, well-mannered lives. The table is set with friendly tools. There is a shallow dish of water that remembers mountain snow without bragging. There is a wooden comb not for hair but for light. She draws it over the apple's surface to separate shine from glare, the way a patient host separates identical spoons. Icon hums a melody that probably existed before melodies discovered they could be clever. She has 6 baskets and a method so gentle it might have been taught by Moss. The first basket is for apples that are thinking about cool mornings. The second is for apples that are thinking about warm afternoons. The third is for apples that would rather not be asked what they are thinking about. The fourth is for trade, the fifth for ceremony, and the sixth, always left with one polite space for someone who arrives late and has the kind of day that needs an apple to quietly reset its spine. She keeps a little ledger, not because eternity requires receipts, but because satisfaction often does. In the margin, she writes remarks that sound like weather reports with feelings. Crimson behaving, green considering a career, and gloss. One small freckle adopted by the light. She knows the older stories about herself, the ones where dwarfs get. Ideas and gods become temporarily forgetful about how time works without fruit, but those tailies have been folded and put away in the drawer where significant events go to rest. Tonight she is interested in a more difficult magic, uniformity. She turns the apples until their stems point in the same thoughtful direction, and the room sighs the way a bookshelf does when all the spines have finally agreed on posture. She tastes a slice not for sweetness, but for a temperature she calls afternoon memory, that warm but not tired. Interval when tea thinks about cooling, but hasn't committed. She keeps a brass weight shaped like a small sleeping bird to hold down passing breezes that try to reorganize her paper tags. She corrects them with a smile that says, "Thank you," but the tags are shy and do not like new places. When Braggy visits, and he always does, as reliably as a rhyme finding its match, he leans in the doorway like punctuation at ease. He recites a gentle couplet to an audience of 2, his wife and a bowl of peels. The apples listen better. Her favorite meter is the one that does not complain about being measured. He offers a line about youth walking in circles, and she nods, pleased with the geometry. The pantry has its own acoustics, all wood and linen and stored afternoons, and the verse goes on brushing against the edges like a cat, benign and unconcerned. In a jar near the window live the small seeds that accidentally volunteered for later. She rotates the jar a quarter turn each day so the seeds can see something new. It is their version of travel. The work continues at the pace of someone counting to a very large number without being sure why, a pace that, incidentally, suits the gods. She selects an apple with a color that could be called sunset that remembered its manners. The cloth for dew is cool. The cloth for dust is patient. The cloth for the idea of fingerprints is absurd but useful because it removes what might have happened. Every fourth apple she holds to her ear and listens for the gentle hollow that says the fruit is breathing normally. This is not science, and yet science would not object. It would ask for her notebook and then admire the handwriting. She records how each apple's weight sits in the hand, whether the skin whispers or says nothing at all, and whether the scent prefers the shelf or the palm. She writes pocket-friendly next to a small one, table conversation next to a larger one, and keeps secrets next to the shyest of the lot. The room accumulates a perfume that could teach a meadow to be humble. Now the baskets are ready, and the habit of the garden calls. The path from pantry to orchard is not far, just long enough to let a thought finish its sentence. The trees stand like individuals who remember being chosen, and the grass is kept at a practical height, the way you keep hair when you plan to think a lot. These are present and professional. They have a union or something that acts like one, with breaks that coincide suspiciously with sunlight on particular stones. Icon knows the names of certain bees because certain bees insisted. There's Ingeborg, who prefers clover, and Stig, who visits dandelions as if they were relatives you should not ignore. She waters with a can that has a thoughtful dent. Each stroke of water is neither too much nor too little, the way a good sentence knows when to stop. It is a quiet marvel to watch an immortal gardener avoid drama. She trims a leaf not because the leaf did anything wrong, but because the branch likes to be understated. In this quarter of Asgard, the seasons are encouraged to take their time. Winter has a key to the gate, but never lets itself in without knocking. Summer arrives with a neat bundle of early evenings. Spring brings paperwork for birds to fill out. The birds sign with feathers and move on, satisfied that bureaucracy can be kind. The trees remember the years and rings that nobody pries into. Icon hums to them in 2 registers, one for roots, low and patient, one for leaves, high and amused. She ties a ribbon loosely around a branch that has been brave through wind. This is not necessary, but many important gestures are not. A robin does a small inspection tour and approves the ribbon in a non-committal way that robs specialize in. If a cloud drifts low enough to read the tags, it pretends not to. Back in the pantry, the afternoon folds its sleeves. Deliveries are prepared with the ceremony of everyday kindness. She uses shallow bowls that prefer corners. Each bowl is lined with straw that she tells no story about, which is its own story. For the Allfather, she chooses a specimen that tastes like decisions made with both eyes open. For Thor, she selects something robust with polite thunder in it. For Frigg, an apple that pairs well with domestic miracles like missing socks returning and soup simmering at exactly the right sincerity. For Freya, one that holds the perfume of a field that has been complimented but not overwhelmed. There are extra bowls with nobody's name on them. They go to corridor tables so chance may choose. She writes little notes that are not quite poetry. For after the 3rd meeting, for before the harp, for the walk you keep promising yourself. At a small balance she keeps on purpose. She weighs an apple against a handful of feathers because the world appreciates symbolism that knows its job. The pan settles with a sigh that could be taken for contentment anywhere. She records the reading not in grams or stones, but in quills. An apple may be 1 quill and a friendly half. On another line, she marks how quickly the fragrance introduces itself when the apple is cut. Arrives like a considerate guest. Arrives like afternoon sun through a kitchen window. Arrives and remembers to close the door. She doesn't rate them. Rating invites arguments, and apples prefer peace. Once a month, she calibrates the balance using a pebble from the base of Yggdrasil that everyone agrees is exactly itself, which is the best kind of standard. Visitors sometimes ask whether youth comes from the fruit or from the attention. Icon smiles in a way that suggests yes. She offers a slice, not the whole apple, because work should be shared and immortality, like bread, benefits from being torn in company. She lectures gently on the proper angle of bite, which is approximately the angle of a secret told by someone trustworthy. She cautions against crumbs near scrolls. She recommends a walk after eating, not because magic requires it, but because digestion helps. Bragi wanders through again, revising a line so quietly the line revises him back. He tries a kenning age as locksmith, and she approves with a nod that could launch a fleet if fleets were launched by nods, and if anything needed launching. When bowls leave the pantry, they travel with a soft retinue of expectations. A handmaiden carries 2, a messenger 3, a minor god with a conscientious streak 4. The handles of the bowls are wrapped in cloth, the color of forgiveness. Icon signs a small slate with a chalk that leaves almost no trace, a list of where the apples think they are going. Sometimes an apple changes its mind and stops in the library. Sometimes one prefers a bench under a roof's shadow. This is not dereliction, it is distribution. She trusts the household to find them, to eat them with the serious playfulness good fruit invites. There is a station near the meat hall where she always pauses. The shelf there is cut slightly crooked on purpose so that the bowls lean toward the reach of a tired hand. She leaves 2 apples and a note that says nothing but means, "Here's a reason to pause between songs." The skalds pretend they never notice who leaves the apples. Then they recite a stanza about small gifts that do not ask for noise. The hall smells of cedar and arguments stored for later. The apples absorb no quarrel, only warmth. A hound noses the straw, decides philosophy is not edible, and returns to a nap. All of this is written down in the ledger as routine good. Occasionally, the Norns request a consultation. They do not call it that, but threats appear near the doorway, and one of them says, as if remarking on the weather, that certain lines and certain lives could benefit from fruit-based interventions. Icon brings a basket and listens the way one listens to rain, deciding how long to stay. The conversation is not about fate in capital letters. It is about calendars, which are kinder. This one needs something tart on the morning of the 7th, a Norn murmurs. An Icon nods, writes 7th tart, and adds a ribbon to the handle for her own remembering. She tucks a slice into the fold of a timeline as casually as someone placing a bookmark in a well-used recipe. Somewhere, a difficult afternoon hesitates, then softens. No fanfare. She records the outcome as thread, less stubborn. Late day brings the quiet task of recovering what the house did not claim. She walks the corridors, a basket on her arm, collecting apples that engaged in conversations and forgot to be eaten. She checks for bruises the way a librarian checks spines for overzealous reading. An apple with a thumbprint is smoothed with a compliment. Another with a scuff remembers the floor. She reminds it that floors forgive. She runs into Tyr, who carries a bowl with disciplined care. He thanks her with a nod that has the weight of treaties. She runs into Sif, who asks for a recipe that does not exist. Icon suggests slicing a certain way so the slices look like coins being thoughtful. She runs into Loki, who offers a joke which the apples accept and then improve by remaining apples. Evening returns to the orchard like a well-trained echo. The trees settle, the bees submit their timesheets, and the grass levels its voice. Icon sits on a small stool with a handle cut out of the sea so it can hang neatly on a peg. She writes a few lines to the day. Good color honesty, no wind arguments, 3 birds approving the watering, and closes the ledger with the satisfying thwop that tells a task it has been witnessed. Brage brings a harp and plays the note that makes leaves quieter. Beyond the fence, the sky practices its blues. A fox walks by with the air of someone who knows where voles keep their diaries. She offers the fox nothing because the fox is already confident in the world's provisions, and confidence is a meal you should not interrupt. Night in Asgard is bright enough to see by and dark enough to rest in. Back in the pantry, she tucks each remaining apple into its lane, as a mother tucks hair behind the ear of a child who would rather keep it in front. She covers the bowls with cloth lids that fall with the same softness as forgiveness. The brass bird on the scale sleeps without needing to be told. She sharpens the pencil because a sharp pencil is a small way of showing respect to tomorrow. She pours water into a cup and adds, for herself, one thin wedge from an apple that is nearly poem and nearly bread. The taste says quietly that tomorrow is already on time. On the high shelf, a jar of honey glows like a patient lantern. She tips it just far enough to watch the air bubble behave. That bubble is a scholar of gravity. It moves slow, teaches slower, and never once asks for applause. If you want to imagine a picture of immortality, you could do worse than a bubble in honey deciding which direction is which. She straightens a label that has dreamed of adventure, and writes a new date in the careful way people write on calendars they intend to keep. Somewhere outside, a raven clicks its beak like a friendly metronome. The pantry answers by being already in time. Before bed, Icon performs the smallest ceremony, one so modest it could be mistaken for tidiness. She selects an apple at random, the way fate pretends to be chance, and whispers a simple promise into the skin. Tomorrow, you will belong to someone who needs you to be exactly yourself. She replaces the apple without marking which it was, because the promise knows. She pinches the lamp top and lets the room become a darker kind of clean. On the threshold, she pauses, not to check anything, but to notice that nothing needs checking. The basket handles are sleeping. The cloths are composed. The ledger dreams of columns that add up to reassurance. If you are still with her, you have adopted her speed, which is slower than desire and faster than regret. The corridor has learned to be quiet in gratitude. At the window, she opens the latch, a finger's width so the night can file its whisper. Bragi's harp has gone to bed, leaning against its own shadow. An apple somewhere breathes out the faintest suggestion of meadow, and the room smiles back because rooms can. Icon sets the pencil parallel with the table edge, not because the gods will notice, but because order shines more gently when no one is looking. She leaves the door not quite shut. The house slows its heartbeat to the rhythm of sap. Far away, the tree that holds the world adjusts one root like a sleeper reaching for a cooler part of the pillow. We will not follow her into sleep. That is her business and the apples. But we can remain a moment longer with the bowls under their linen lids and a ledger that says nothing alarming. Somewhere a bee dreams responsibly. Somewhere a fox approves of nothing in particular. The pantry keeps its scent, which is the fragrance of time folded neatly. If morning asks what was accomplished, the answer will be the same as always. A great many small things properly and in good order, which is the kind of immortality you can carry in your pocket without anyone noticing until they do, and even then they will only smile and take a slice. You might not expect the loudest horn in the world to spend most of its life listening, but that is what Jollyhern prefers, and Heimdall, who knows a preference when he hears one, wipes the mouthpiece with linen as if polishing a quiet thought. The hour is the thin one before dawn has committed to anything. Mist laces the edges of the rainbow road the way sleepy icing clings to the last corner of a cake. Heimdall stands where the bridge leans out of the clouds and checks the air like a baker testing dough. 2 fingers pressed into the breeze to feel whether the night has risen enough. He sets the horn on a padded rest, 3 layers of wool, always 3, and watches the surface take the first rumor of color. If you're still awake a little later, feel free to follow this watch with a subscription to the ancient art of not missing anything. Or don't, the watch will keep itself either way. He rubs a smudge from the bow with a circle that has forgotten how to end, and the metal answers by pretending to be moonlight one last time before morning claims it. The 9 mothers who bore him are asleep somewhere in the sea's memory, and the surf pats the shore in a meter even his hearing admires for its modest arithmetic. He counts what can be counted and nods at what should only be noticed. The bridge's first band, the red one that remembers embers, warms as if it had spent the night thinking about cherries. The orange follows with the yawn of a small hearth. Yellow arranges itself tidily like wheat that understands calendars. Green returns with a quiet shoe squeak of moss. Blue unfolds like a page in a book that nobody dog-eared. Indigo does its private work. Violet lifts its hem to keep from brushing the mist. Heimdall touches each hue with the back of his hand, the way you test a kettle you trust. He keeps a notebook. Of course, every guardian does, but his is written in a script that looks like weather reports for careful eyes. Today's entry begins with, Bridge held its breath at the second band. Exhale approved, and continues with, Colors cooperative. No opinionated birds. He hears the frost recite the night's inventory. 3 soft cracks from the far pine, 1 fox sigh near the root of a hill that has adopted the fox as a moving ornament, and the regular metal murmur of the city before it remembers to wake. This would be nothing to most ears. To his it is enough music to fill a winter. There are rituals to the polish. The cloth is folded in the old way, corners to center, a square that becomes another square, a domestic geometry that reassures valves and gods. He dusts the horn with a powder so light it is embarrassed by its own ambition, then coaxes it away with a feather fan that came from a bird who never collected a complaint in its entire life. He inspects the seam where the 2 halves meet and touches the spot that always wants to be dramatic. Not today, he tells it, and drama, having good hearing too, retires without protest. He lifts the horn, not high, just enough to respect the bruisable air, and tests a breath that is more sentiment than sound. The echo that returns is content to be mistaken for silence. He nods once, making a note with the slightest raise of one eyebrow that the hinge at the strap prefers a drop of oil. The oil is pale as a polite answer. He keeps it in a small bottle, shaped like a teardrop that changed its mind, which is the kind of shape tools understand. The frost itself has upkeep that is less spectacular than its songs suggest. Heimdall walks along the arc with a brush made from the first grass that forgave winter. He brushes dew toward the edge so it can fall to earth and report to rivers. He checks for the tiny scratches that happen when winds practice their handwriting against color, and he smooths them with a paste that smells faintly of clean linen and distant thunder. He carries a loop of braided silver for measuring the bridge's mood. He lowers it at the red and counts heartbeats until the loop hums. The number should be between 15 and whatever 15 feels like today. It is. He smiles in the way that makes all his teeth look like part of the same thought. His hearing reaches down the world's stem, a bee rehearsing its first root of the morning, a barrow stone considering lichen, a farmer deciding where to place a gate and then placing it. Precisely there, a kettle murmuring that it will almost boil when asked a second time. Visitors rarely interrupt this hour, but footprints do. They arrive unaccompanied, as if the feet wanted independent lives. Heimdall keeps a small rake for prints, the way gardeners keep rakes for gravel. He draws long, patient lines where soft signs have crossed, not to erase them, but to make them comfortable. Footprints on Bifrost are a kind of letter. He reads them and answers by tightening their edges. Thor's prints are enthusiastic and circular, like punctuation with opinions. Freya's are precise as lace. Loki's are wherever they should not be and also exactly where they need to be, which is the uncomfortable talent of certain friends. Once in a great while, an unfamiliar tread appears that steps as if walking were a hypothesis. Heimdall writes, curious, in a ledger and offers the bridge a small nod that means pay attention without raising your voice. The rainbow never raises its voice. It prefers to persuade. There is a stand at the bridgehead for cups and for the small box that contains things that may be needed. The label is written in Bragi's hand because poets like to lend italics to practicalities. Inside are thread, a needle, a nail the size of a well-behaved splinter, 3 safety pins, a string that has remembered every knot anyone ever taught it, and a folded note that reads, in case of unanticipated poem, take one small pause. The cups are stoneware, glazed with a blue that is nearly horizon. Heimdall drinks barley tea that has taken advice from clouds and learned to be light. He holds the cup by the handle because that is what handles are for, and he watches the steam carry tiny announcements to the place in the air where news waits its turn. He has 9 small bells set along the guard. They are not for alarms. The horn would take insult. The bells keep him honest about wind. Each bell has a voice like a different kind of coin. If 3 ring at once, it means a storm is pacing in another paragraph of the sky. If none ring, it means the day is having a private thought. He writes it down. He notes the exact moment a bird uses the bridge for shortcut. Ravens are irregulars. Doves sometimes pretend to be ravens for professional development, and he marks whether their feathers look like they slept enough. He is the sort of watchman who knows the difference between tired and thinks being tired looks mysterious. Today's birds are well rested, which bodes well for conversations later. You might wonder about his famous hearing and whether it ever asks for a day off. The truth is soft. Heimdall's hearing does not shout, it sorts. He hears 10,000 things and arranges them on shelves labeled urgent to someone else, urgent to me, and pleasant to acknowledge. Most sounds go on the last shelf. The sea always goes there in all its reasonable authority. A baby's first laugh gets 2 shelves and a smile. An argument in a kitchen that results in bread instead of decisions goes on the shelf called resolved responsibly. He hears spiders tying loose corners of mourning with soap and compliments them for the quality of their knots. He hears regret deciding it will visit after lunch. He schedules a walk. He hears a word somewhere pronounced as if it were a stone you could pocket. He places the cup on the stone step and listens to it cool until the handle forgets it ever carried heat. This is the kind of attention that makes a bridge stay proud. Sometimes he practices the call. Not the call, not the one that shakes rust from forgotten weapons. He practices the idea of calling. He puts the horn to his lips and breathes the shape of a note into the passages without asking it to be born. The sound does what a sleeping lake does when a fish turns hardly anything, but you see it, and that is enough. He steps back, pleased that nothing has startled. He oils the strap and checks the buckles, and then pretends for exactly 2 heartbeats that the horn is heavy. It never is. The weight lives elsewhere in promises. Heimdall collects promises the way other people collect stamps, carefully, in little books that no one else wants to carry, but that everyone is glad exist. At this hour, Bifrost receives fewer declarations and more questions. A shepherd thinks, without saying, that a certain lamb is bolder than the others. The thought floats up like steam and drifts by Heimdall's ear. He stamps it, accurate, with a rubber stamp he keeps only in imagination, but uses with professional frequency. A fisherman measures patience against rope length and agrees they are related. A scholar holding 2 sentences that cannot live in the same room decides to build a bigger room. The decision walks by as lightly as a moth behaving itself. Heimdall doesn't interfere with these small migrations of choice. He simply takes attendance. If a decision forgets to show up, he coughs gently. Usually that is enough. He inventories the bridge's shadows, which link them like cats, stretching one at a time. The far end wears a shadow like a shawl. The near end prefers a scarf. He marks the line where shadow leaves color and notes whether the line trembles from breeze or impatience. Impatience occasionally appears in the corner of someone's day and tries to look tall. Heimdall provides a chair. He is good at seating plans for emotions. Worry sits in the front, but only long enough to feel included. Doubt sits near a window and looks out at a pine that is not concerned. He'll pass the aisle in a book. When they have all settled and decided to behave, he rings one small bell, and the meeting adjourns with the sound of polite shoes. A few industrious dwarfs have laid a set of maintenance stones at the foot of the bridge, neatly labeled with runes that mean handy. Heimdall inspects them out of respect, though he has never needed more than the smallest. A notch here, a tap there. The bridge straightens like a spine that has just remembered posture. The dwarfs also left a tiny plaque that reads, "If found misaligned, apply kindness." He touches it once for luck, and once for the habit of touching it once for luck. He keeps a tool that is essentially a kindly spoon for rainbows. Nobody knows how it works. It probably asks nicely. There is, near the seventh color, a place where the air likes to gather rumors. Heimdall leans his hip against the balustrade and listens for weather gossip. Today the clouds are swapping recipes for shade. One claims that the best gray contains the memory of a robin's egg, which sounds improbable until you consider how complicated grays are. Another argues for a pinch of lavender. They will manage without him. Far below, a field sets its dew at an angle that will look excellent from a distance and completely ordinary up close, which is the plan for most of the world's beauty. He writes, "Field understands audience," and underlines it because the field, however clever, cannot underline itself. If a traveler approaches, he adjusts his posture like a doorman whose building is the sky. He does not ask for names arrive by themselves. He notices whether the traveler's shoulders carry a hill or a feather and sets the welcome accordingly. He issues a small ceremonial nod to any shoes that have made honest mistakes. He has a discreet brush for boots that brought a piece of the far road with them and would like to leave it without fuss. A polite sign appears next to his elbow whenever someone looks as if they might like permission. You may rest here as if you had always been meaning to. Those who do not need it do not see it. Those who do see it and feel suddenly taller. Now, almost without warning, the world starts assembling a morning. Heimdall checks the seam of color again. He polishes one last circle into the bow and can see, in the reflection, a small patch of sky that has given up being mysterious and now focuses on being useful. He places the horn in its loop and straightens a strap that was attempting to tell a story about adventures it never had. He pours a final measure of barley tea into the step offerings. These days are practical, and the stone accepts it with the gratitude of a thing that wears weather with patience. He lifts a book from the shelf of his little alcove, the book nobody believes a guard should own, a collection of quiet poems about bridges that never collapsed. He reads 2 lines that are mostly road and one that is mostly air. This is how he resets, by trusting structures that have proved they can hold themselves. The handover with the day is unceremonious. Sunlight splashes a little. It always does, like a child who has not yet learned there is enough water for everyone. Heimdall smiles at the mess and wipes the droplets from the horn with the same cloth as before. His rituals do not call for luxury, only repetition. He greets the first full color and congratulates Blue on arriving without practicing in the hallway. He listens one last time to the space under the bridge, where echoes sleep. They wake slowly, stretch, and promise not to run indoors. He gathers the bells into stillness and arranges the cups with the handles, all pointing in the direction of the day's responsibilities. There is an etiquette to departing a watch. He writes it in his head as he does it. Step back without leaving. Breathe as if the air had been saving itself for you. Make the horn comfortable without making it lazy. Let the bridge believe it achieved morning on its own. The only sound he adds is the soft click of the hinge on the small box of things that may be needed. He leaves the note visible. In case of unanticipated poem, take one small pause. He suspects today will not need it, but days enjoy being trusted with choices. He straightens the ledger and leaves the pencil parallel to the edge of the shelf, because parallel lines, like good neighbors, rarely argue. From here, he will walk along the outer parapet, where a sash of wind tries on the day's temperature like a scarf in a mirror. He will pass a tiny cairn of pebbles that count afternoons for a living. He will nod to a spider who keeps its web at a height where morning's light signs its autograph. He will listen to the cities, all of them, greet their windows. He will listen to a meadow teach bees in a whisper that still manages to reach him perfectly. He will listen to a child in a farmhouse on a hill pronounce a new word almost correctly and file it under promising. His hearing will carry none of this as a burden. It will file and file again until everything is small enough to be true. By the time the sun has fully decided and the last violet thread has stopped pretending to be night, the horn shines with its customary restraint. The bridge hums with contentment the way a cat hums with heat. And Heimdall has become so ordinary you might mistake him for a well-made hinge. He prefers it that way. He offers the day a final courtesy, a single tap of a finger on the rim of the bell, the sound of a coin politely placed in a jar, and the bridge answers with a shimmer that thinks better of turning into spectacle. If anything dire were to happen, the horn would do what it was made to do, and the worlds would rearrange their schedules to pay attention. But nothing dire happens, because most hours are built of undramatic maintenance, and those are the hours that decide what news will look like when it finally arrives. So the watch folds itself into the morning like an extra blanket returned to its shelf. Footprints fade as if they have absorbed the lesson about being enough. The bells hang in readiness that does not stare. The small box waits for a day that will need a poem. Heimdall presses the warm part of the stone once with his palm, the way you think a chair, and steps aside so the bridge can do what bridges do when no one is looking. Stay. If you are still awake, let the horn's silence be the last thing you hear before sleep turns the page. The guardian will stand where color meets cloud, counting the softest sounds and letting them all add up to a morning you can step onto without thinking about your feet. You might not expect immortality to squeak, but the pantry door does, very softly, as if eternal youth were kept behind it in jars and did not like drafts. Idun hums the kind of tune that knows only one note and is happy about it. She balances a shallow basket on her hip, lined with wool that has forgotten how to be loud. Inside are apples the color of sunrise when it has decided not to try too hard. She checks them the way a librarian checks spines, one finger along the row, eyes skimming for a boredom that means everything is in order. Each apple has a tag, a small slip of birch with a rune burned into it, time tree, day of polish, personality if any. It is not that the fruit of youth needs management exactly, but the gods do. The apples merely cooperate. If you are still awake in a few minutes, you may subscribe to the practice of monitoring ripeness without interrupting it. Or you might simply drift. Idun will not be offended. She has 3 shelves to straighten and a cloth to soften with, and these are steady occupations that reward listeners who don't insist on conclusions. The orchard of Irevallar begins where the wind runs out of reasons to be brisk. Trees stand with ordinary patience, their branches arranged like careful sentences. No exclamation marks, all commas and periods. The ground is a common green, not the bragging kind, and the paths remember every boot and paw without ranking them. Idun walks the outer ring first, counting fences as if they were sheep. Each post receives a greeting, a touch, a word, sometimes a suggestion about leaning less. The gate carries a wooden sign that says, "Welcome," and runes that look a little surprised, probably because Loki carved them, and his letters always pretend they weren't expecting guests. The bees have their own opinions about order, which Idun respects. She nods when they convene a meeting over clover and files the minutes in her head under productive buzz. The apples are small this early, practicing being circles, fierce about it the way children are fierce about being 5. There is a bench where the path thinks before it turns. The bench is neither comfortable nor proud. It is exactly what a bench should be, Flat, willing, uncomplaining in drizzle. Idun sits and writes the day's first notes with a charcoal stub that stains her thumb like a helpful bruise. Second tree from south fence favors shade. Adjusts canopy. New thrush nest near post 9 advised cat. She pauses to listen to the well where reflecting happens for a living. The water remembers the sky with admirable accuracy. In its surface, she sees a piece of cloud trying on the shape of a boat and deciding against the commitment. She is generous with her approval. After all, not every cloud needs to be a vehicle. When the wind sends a report of distant ocean salt distance, the affirmative sigh of a tide that has kept its appointment, she files that too. Under background courage, inventory is the quiet sport of apples. Idun carries a chalk that marks without boasting and a cloth that removes chalk without regret. She inspects for flaws, not because flaws are forbidden, but because they prefer to be introduced rather than discovered. A tiny bruise is a story told too quickly. She slows it with a finger's worth of balm. A scuff near the stem is an argument with a leaf, easily mediated. She weighs an apple in her palm and lets it teach her the day's units. These are not ounces or stones, but something like solidity per expectation. The best apples are heavy in the way a good nap is heavy. She balances one on a small scale anyway, 2 bronze weights and an opinion. The opinion wins. Enough, she tells it, which apples here is praise. She keeps a polishing schedule that makes sense to very few people and all apples. Monday is for clockwise circles, Tuesday for counterclockwise, Wednesday for letting the cloth decide, Thursday for experimental ovals if no one is watching, Friday for doing exactly what worked on Tuesday to see if consistency proves its worth again. She avoids Saturday because apples deserve a day for their own shine. And Sunday belongs to counting, a religious act in some households, an agricultural one here. The cloth is linen soft as a rumor. She moves it in little storms over the peel, not to force a gleam, but to invite it. The gleam is shy. It likes to feel it appeared by its own reasoning. The gods arrive the way customers arrive at a very old bakery, cheerful, entitled, and certain that their preferred loaf is waiting. Odin comes with a notebook of Raven's opinions and a look that suggests he has solved aging again. He never has, but Idun listens with the kindness one uses for a neighbor who explains weather to a window. Frigg arrives with the air of someone who has already tidied the day, twice and expects only a little cooperation from physics. Thor has the good grace to remove his gauntlets before touching the basket. Not that one, Idun says pleasantly, and Thor looks chastened, as any child would when told that the cookie he wanted has volunteered for someone else's destiny. Freya prefers apples with a blush, as if embarrassed by their own usefulness. Tyr takes whatever is nearest with the stoic precision of a person who has made peace with decisions. Jared visits on sea-scented mornings and selects an apple that seems to know about tides. There's paperwork, which surprises exactly no one who has lived long enough to seek youth from a bureaucrat. Idun keeps a ledger with columns neat as a hedgerow. God, portion, reason, return date. The reason is often routine maintenance, because gods are machines made of persistence. Occasionally, it is ceremonial, which means someone plans to make a speech and would like their knees to approve. Very rarely, it is afterthought, a category Loki invented when he returned an apple that had somehow turned into a pear. And Idun wrote without irritation, shape-shifted by proximity to confusing intentions. She places a check mark when the apple's work has been tasted. Most pages are simply rows of small, repeated comforts. Immortality, like bookkeeping, is at its best when not dramatic. The pantry itself could be mistaken for a very clean stable. There are pegs and hooks, ropes coiled like well-trained snakes, baskets lined like nests, and a pleasant smell of wood that understands the long game. The door is oak, and it complains softly in a voice like a startled soprano whenever it opens. Idun oils the hinges with something that might be Bee's advice made liquid. The shelves are labeled in a script that owes a debt to tidy weather. Just ripe, still thinking, not for today, ceremonial, and a small section, special cases, that contains a single apple with a tiny star near its stem that refuses to discuss its plans. Above the top shelf are jars of dried peel shavings and apple blossom tea, because even miracles have byproducts, and waste is an opinion she does not share. She keeps a timer, a sand glass that measures as if it had all the time in the world to spend on one drop. When the upper bulb empties, she turns it with a politeness that suggests she has asked permission. The sand declines to answer. She turns it anyway. Timing matters mostly for her own discipline and the theatrics of waiting, which must be performed with honesty or not at all. She times how long each visitor takes to decide on an apple. Thor is quick. Odin is not. Sif chooses as if writing a poem with her thumb. Loki invites the sand to misbehave. It never does, but she watches him watch it and writes, observed attempting to earn a shrug from physics in the ledger. The sand has resisted shrugs for centuries. Quiet rumor on the subject of youth insists that apples do the entire job while the eater does nothing at all. Idun smiles at this and continues polishing. The truth is domestic, the fruit is a collaborator. It brings its clarity to a body that has remembered to be grateful for joints, for steady heartbeats, for breath that knows the corridor. The eater brings courtesy, which is made of chewing with attention and swallowing without argument. She has observed that those who think their teeth, even privately, look refreshed sooner. Gratitude is apparently water-soluble dot. There's also the matter of storage. Idun stacks baskets with an attention to airflow that would impress a seafarer. She leaves 2 finger widths between each, the secret distance at which apples do not bicker. She places rosemary and sage in the corners to give the pantry a time of year smell, even when seasons are distracted. A small clay dish of salt considers moisture that has strayed from its lane. She doubts the salt accomplishes anything measurable, but it appreciates the appointment, and she likes to staff the room with helpers who believe in their job description. Above the doorway hangs a horseshoe that fell off Sleipnir once while he was practicing modest speeds. It is good luck, she is told. She has never needed it. Apples bring their own luck if you do not rush them. From time to time, someone brings up the incident with Jossie, as if a single disruptive parenthesis could define the long sentence of her work. Idun nods, the nod of a person who has been temporarily misplaced and would rather not be misfiled again. She does not tell the story because other people tell it loudly enough to deafen patience. She notes, in her private book of principles, that trust prefers to be habitual, and that baskets placed where they belong return themselves to calm. The trees kept growing during that adventure. That is what she remembers. Growth is stubborn about continuing. Midday arrives like someone who forgot they were late. The sun leans into the orchard with the interest of a warm cat. Idun adjusts the shade screens, the woven mats she posts between the more forward trees and their modest neighbors. Some trees will take all the attention if you let them. Others thrive when ignored. She strings a line of bells along the inner fence. Their only job is to recommend breezes to apples. When they ring together, it is time to move a basket from one shelf to another. When they ring reluctantly, it is time to nap. She does not argue with bells. Lunch is bread and cheese eaten with a knife that believes in geometry. She has a pot of onion jam that tastes like patience achieved at low temperature. She offers a slice to a passing squirrel and gets only a glance, which is fair. Squirrels have work in progress always, and their project management style has no room for condiments. She eats while standing, leaning where the fence leans, and counts the crows. Crows are an honest measure of afternoon. 3 means the day has decided on an ending time. 5 means Freyr is planning a harvest he will claim surprised him. 7 means Odin is rehearsing a speech in his head, and the ravens have decided not to correct him yet. Asterisk. By late afternoon, the apples look as if they have seduced the light into staying a little longer. Idun rotates the baskets a quarter turn so no one grows a favorite view. She murmurs to them, nonsense mostly, a river of well-intended sentences about how crispness is a shared responsibility and how even sweetness appreciates a little discipline. She sings once badly but accurately, which is the way trees prefer to be sung to. A bee lands on her sleeve and cleans its face. She compliments the bee's thoroughness and resists the urge to evaluate the wings for symmetry. There are limits to in her management. Visitors run for their refuels. The appointments are swift. A sip, a bite, the old recipe for courage reprinted daily. Old age has sharp elbows. The apples soften them. Balder strolls in, too radiant to need much, but he takes a slice to be polite. For mother, he says, because kindness travels that direction by reflex. Idun wraps the slice in a leaf that used to be shade. Tell her the orchard is considering a new trellis, she adds. She will have opinions. He laughs the way windows laugh when the sun opens them. Loki returns his earlier afterthought with a flourish. The pear is now an apple again, exact in everything but humility. Please sign here, Idun says, and he does, a rune so simple it could hold any meaning later. She files it under future topic. As the light loosens its grip, she moves to the pantry for the evening arrangement. The shelves go from bright order to dusky comfort, like a market packing itself back into baskets. She lifts the little star-marked apple from special cases and holds it up until the first. Mauve confuses it with a quiet moon. She places it back more carefully than necessary. She straightens the tags, polished cloths, chalk, charcoal, balm. She closes the ledger with the gentle conviction of a judge who likes everyone in the courtroom. She writes a final line on the day's page, all accounted for. Confidence at room temperature. The orchard makes night in unhurried layers. The fence posts stop pretending to be guard towers and admit they are wooden. The path shrinks to a clear idea you can follow with your shoes. The trees talk to one another in leaf language, which is a vocabulary of size. Idun carries a lantern whose flame has good manners. She takes the long route to the door so she can kiss her favorite trunk with one hand. The favorite is not the most productive or the bravest or the most photogenic. It is the tree that learned quickest how to rest. She admires that in fruit-bearing things. She closes the gate softly. It sighs like a book nearing its last page and remembering there are other books. Inside, the pantry cools into a room that can be trusted, the kind of room all houses wish they had if they were honest with their architects. She lights another lamp and sets it behind a glass that used to be a river. The apples receive the lamplight like compliments while pretending to be indifferent. She arranges a small patrol of mouse-friendly deterrents. Mint leaves, a bell on a string, a cat who has signed a treaty with the mice that states mutual surprise. No more. The cat, gray with 3 thoughts, circles twice and settles near the not for today shelf, because not for today is a cat's favorite law. Now the bookkeeping of youth turns to its dream chapter. Idun sits at the desk and opens the thin book she keeps for things that are not strictly business. The pages are thick and patient. She writes observations that will matter to her future self and no one else. Sweetness higher when rain held its breath at noon. Fragrance polite, color subdued. Thor tried to return a stem that didn't belong to him. Accepted apology. Assigned him to carry baskets for 5 minutes. Apology completed. She sketches a picture of an apple as seen by a moth, which is a small moon with a personality. She writes in the corner, remember to ask Freyr whether he wants the old ladder mended or retired with honors, because even ladders have histories that should be treated as guests. She knows people imagine that apple work keeps her young too, as if proximity were a spell. It is not like that. She is young because she keeps choosing to be bored by drama and interested in maintenance. She lists this under causes. She recognizes that eternity is just punctuality repeated. A god who arrives on time for calm will live a very long time. A god who counts his breaths the way ducks count ducklings will not misplace any. The apples help, of course. They are small, edible reminders that time prefers to be measured in fruit rather than in horns and battles. She licks her thumb and turns the page just to hear the paper say yes. A breeze infiltrates the pantry through the crack that belongs to breezes. It tells her the stars have distributed themselves according to an ancient seating chart. She steps outside with the lantern lowered to ankle height, so moths will not think she is launching a ceremony. She sings to the orchard again, 2 notes this time, the musical equivalent of a handshake. The trees answer by not moving, which in trees is a very formal response. She walks the perimeter and listens for the steady chew of the sheep in the far field, a sound like fabric being returned to a shelf. Somewhere, a fox practices stealth with the confidence of a student carrying a permission slip. She approves the curriculum. Returning, she finds the cat still busy at the business of sleeping. She lifts the chalk and writes on a tiny slate near the door, "Tomorrow, check trellis. Rotate baskets. Encourage modest juiciness." She hangs the slate back on its nail and places the nail back in the day, metaphorically, where it holds. She takes down a small pouch of herb tea meant for late brains. It tastes like polite rain. She drinks and feels her thoughts queue up without jockeying for position. She imagines a god arriving at dawn, yawning, asking for a simpler day in the complicated language of divinity. She decides which apple will volunteer, a round one with the dignity of an old coin. Before sleep, she conducts the apple bedtime. Good night, she murmurs, a repetition that refits time to size. She lowers a thin cloth across the front of the shelves, not to hide them, but to suggest they could dream without witnesses. She ties the cloth with little knots who learned patience from sailors. She carries her lamp through the orchard, once more in a path that history would recognize from every evening since anyone cared to mark evenings. She pauses under the favorite tree and counts to 9 with the particular attention you give to numbers that have volunteered often. She thanks the soil for being the air's quiet partner. She thanks the moon for rehearsing circles so apples would have a metaphor. She thanks the wind for not proofreading the leaves too much. Inside the cottage, she places the ledger on the windowsill so it can admire the night at work. She stretches her hands, palms up, to look for stories clinging to the lines. Finding only chalk dust and the memory of handles, she washes them in a basin where the water waits with the patience of a pond. She dries them on a towel that used to be a sail and has never stopped liking wind. She sets the alarm, a string tied to the smallest bell, to ring when the first bird decides to appear early for the day's appointment. It will not wake her. It will simply greet the waking that was already scheduled. If you are still awake, you might find it drowsily amusing that the management of immortality consists largely of polite cloths, politely labeled shelves, and a policy regarding pairs. But this is how longevity prefers to be handled, with habits that look like kindness, when viewed from moments, and like wisdom when viewed from centuries. Idun checks the door, gives the hinge one last drop of oil granted, more for the ritual than the necessity, and listens to the tiny squeak transform into the sort of agreeable exhale you hear from a chair at the end of a meeting. She dims the lamp to a halo that believes in restraint, and the apples agree, with a sheen that admits defeat before darkness in the friendliest way. The night advances not like an army, but like a quilt. The cat rearranges itself into an opinion about corners. The moth pauses at the small star-marked apple and then commits to a wall where it can imagine itself as an idea. The shelves, faced with hours, do what shelves do best: hold and hold again. And the orchard breathes at its own measured pace, lifting and setting the cool, as if teaching lungs that have forgotten the old syllabus. Somewhere, in the tall hall of the gods, a door will open too quickly tomorrow, or a plan will decide to prefer another plan. When it does, a hand will reach for an apple without drama, a bite will introduce the mouth to patience, and the day will resume its order. Youth, after all, is not thunder. It is storage that never lost its label. Idun lies down in the room that tastes of wood and clean wool and promises kept. She closes her eyes with the confidence of someone who left everything perfectly almost. The breath in her chest says yes the way pages say yes when turned by fingers that mine their strength. The ledger sleeps. The same glass streams its endless gravity. Outside, the apples continue their unspectacular miracle. They rest. They wait. They accumulate enough sunrise to give away tomorrow. If your eyes are heavy, let them be. The pantry can take it from here, with its gentle arithmetic of shelves and bowls and baskets and beams, with its temperate weather of lamplight and linen, with its keeper who will wake at the bell and begin again, counting, polishing, watching, and writing down the ordinary magic until the ordinary is magical enough to last. You might expect a watchman posted at the edge of the worlds to be dramatic, but Heimdall prefers tidy weather and a bridge that doesn't squeak. He rises before dawn because the dawn appreciates being expected, and because a rainbow, though famous, needs a little coaxing to remember all its lanes. He steps from his house at Himmelbjerg into the quiet that keeps its hat on, stretches like a well-made bow that will not be fired, and listens to everything at once the way a librarian listens to a building looking for misfiled noises. The sea replies with a steady yes, the sky with an agreeable shrug, a sheep 3 valleys over with what might be a complaint about grass. He has ears that hear the wool on clouds and the dust on hooves, but he treats this as housekeeping, not as a party trick. If you're still awake in a minute, you can subscribe to the practice of hearing without reacting. Heimdall would approve. He finds that even prophecies calm down if you acknowledge them like a friendly draft under a door. The bridge is a rainbow because colors are excellent at pointing, and gods, as a group, like clear instructions. Heimdall walks the arc with a small brush that persuades last night's mist into civilized beads. Red goes first, as usual, the corridor for hurried messengers, orange for dignitaries who move at the pace of important hats, yellow for deliveries that are not urgent but would rather not be rained on, green for those pretending to be unremarkable, blue for people who forget why they got on the bridge halfway across, indigo for ravens on errand, violet for the occasional poet who doesn't mind being a little damp. He checks the width of each band with the span of his hand that has never learned how to lie. He once added a dotted line to remind thunder to keep to the right. It helped exactly as much as a dotted line usually helps thunder, which is to say, it made Heimdall feel better dot at the foot of the bridge he keeps a small toll house. Not for coin gods do not carry pockets in any reliable way, but for notes about passage. Inside there is a shelf labeled Dawns, and another labeled Unexpected Dusk. There is a broom that knows the difference between ash and moon dust. The broom is correct more often than you'd think. There's a peg for Jallarhorn, polished to a quiet gleam and happily idle. Heimdall dusts around the horn with the deference one gives a sleeping infant who is also a volcano. He records the condition of the air, which is usually fit, and the behavior of horizons, which are nearly always cooperative. Once, long ago, a horizon refused to line up with its morning, but it apologized before lunch, and the incident has been filed under Weather's experiments. Heimdall opens the day's ledger and writes the first entry. Bridge checked, 7 lanes compliant, 1 raven already arguing with its own reflection. Permitted. He initials with a rune that looks like a fence and means approximately, I am here. They have. He listens because listening is his craft and his sport. In the distance, he hears a farmer convincing a gate to be social, a child counting to 8 but losing interest at 5, the faint annoyance of a mountain that would like its snow stacked more neatly. The sounds arrive so politely that he has time to put them in their specific mental drawers. Sudden noises do occur. The world occasionally forgets that surprise is a spice, not a staple, but Heimdall does not label the urgent as important until it has proven itself through repetition. This policy has saved him from many a false alarm and at least 2 musical rehearsals. A watcher needs fuel. So he pours porridge that remembers yesterday kindly, sprinkles it with a modest optimism of honey, and eats while reading the daily notices posted by the wind. The wind's handwriting is atrocious but passionate. It claims a shipment of gulls will be late and that a fjord is practicing new acoustics. He marks both items noted and folds the air back into itself. A pair of rams graze near the toll house and answer to names that translate loosely as stay and also stay. He brushes their horns until they have nothing left to complain about. The rams are good companions because they possess the sturdy thinking of things that know what grass is. They evaluate each passerby with the same ethics, committee expression, and are nearly always correct. By mid-morning, the bridge begins to keep appointments. A small delegation from Alfheim crosses in green because elves appreciate being unremarked upon. Heimdall nods in the warm silence that says he recognizes them but will not commit the embarrassment of greeting them too brightly. Odin comes through in blue, hands behind his back, pretending he didn't wake early just to think me a rainbow. He glances at the dotted line, frowns as if thunder might be watching, and moves on. Heimdall writes, one-eyed authority, posture good, intentions pending, ravens unanimous about lunch. Frick follows with the kind smile of someone who carries 3 extra minutes in her pocket for emergencies. Heimdall makes the smallest bow that a bow can be and still function as a bow. All quiet, he says, and she smiles the way kitchens smile when bread rises on schedule. Not all visitors are dramatic. A dwarf arrives with a cart of hinges that expect a door to appreciate them properly. Heimdall inspects the permit, which has been notarized by a hammer, and therefore satisfies all requirements. The dwarf walks the yellow lane and trips only once, which is impressive given the weight of his opinions. A spring goddess sends a letter carried by a robin, and Heimdall stamps it with approval that smells faintly of pine. The robin thanks him by being an excellent rectangle when it sits. Even Loki, drifting over in a mood that has not decided its own color, obeys the toll house ritual. He signs the ledger with a flourish that means nothing in particular and everything later. Heimdall has a special column for Loki's entries titled Interpretive, which allows future clerks to forgive earlier ones. He works mostly with his ears, but he also trusts the skin between his shoulders, which has no special power other than the wisdom of watching bridges and a small brass mirror polished with such diligence that the mirror believes in him. He uses it to check the underside of the rainbow where shadows negotiate. Shadows can be principled when you are thorough. He checks the stress of colors at the arch's crest with a finger tap that any carpenter would recognize and any rainbow would accept as a compliment. He pats the joints where light becomes stone, or stone behaves as if it were trying to live up to light. Everything holds. Things usually do when you ask them nicely and record them afterward. He breaks for tea that tastes like agreeing slowly. While he drinks, he reviews the signals he uses when words are extravagant. 3 taps on the rail mean approach carefully but bring bread. A hum that rises asks for quiet. A hum that falls invites gossip. 2 measured beats on the toll house sill, nevermore, mean I see you. Continue. He practices these until they sound so neutral that even a quarrel would feel bored into civility. Somewhere in the halls of Asgard, a meeting reaches a conclusion that had been waiting for them beneath a pile of discussions. Heimdall hears the sigh of paper, satisfied. He notes the time so he can compliment the secretary later. This is how the world avoids war more often than not. Minutes, chairs, and informed sighs dot at noon. He cleans Jallarhorn with a cloth that knows when not to lint. The horn shines like a promise that loves its claws about exceptions. He tries its voice just above a whisper. The mountains lift their heads politely, say hello, and return to contemplating real estate. He replaces the horn on its peg with a care that would not spill a spoon of soup. His job is to sound the alarm at the end of all things. But meanwhile, there is an end of mourning each day to keep in order, and he handles that too. The great dramas of fate are less common than lunches. As any competent guardian understands, visitors sometimes ask what he hears when nothing is happening. He says nothing is complicated and smiles. He hears the glue of reality remembering to stick. He hears the left boot of a traveler arriving half a blink before the right boot, because boots have personalities. He hears a rumor starting 3 valleys over and forgetting its own verb. He hears a question form in a god's throat and return to the god's chest for later. He hears, faintly but without mistake, a future that will come when it wishes and for now behaves itself. If you are still listening, you may enjoy the trivia that Heimdall can detect a single needle dropping in a haystack kept somewhere in Jotunheim, though he prefers not to interfere. Needles have private lives, and haystacks are a very sensitive dot in the toll house. There is a map of edges. It shows where sea meets land politely and where land interrupts sea like a friend finishing your sentence. Heimdall traces the lines with a finger that has never hurried. He keeps small markers carved of bone, each representing a familiar disturbance. Storm that thinks it's a sculptor, fisherman with epic mood, kingship rehearsing, oxen tired of logic. He moves the markers rarely but deliberately, and when he does, the world finds itself slightly better arranged. The way a room improves when you finally decide where the chair should go. He writes tiny letters in the margins, remind the west wind to be a person, ask the east to consider naps, thank the north for impeccable punctuation. Afternoons bring families, because the view from the bridge recommends itself for unposed portraits. A mother points up a green lane, tells a child this is where ordinary heroes walk, and the child nods solemnly as if already practicing. Heimdall has a pocket full of discreet safety charms, just the smallest blessings, tied with thread, and he lets one drop here and there where a toddler's balance negotiates with excitement. The charms are effective because they think they are string. A pair of elderly spirits discusses fishing knots on the violet lane, which will tolerate nearly any detour so long as it returns with dignity. Heimdall answers a question about whether the rainbow is slippery in rain, with the professional pride of someone who has applied grit in all the right places. It is not slippery, only persuasive. He checks the bridge's silence the way a baker checks the dough's rise. 2 fingers, 1 expectation. Silence is not absence for him, but a medium like wood or wool or water that can be polished. He polishes with patience, which leaves no residue. He can tell when a silence has been interrupted and then apologized. These are the best kind. He can also tell when a silence is pretending to be deeper than it is. Those he ignores until they decide to grow up. A raven lands near his boot and brings a comment from Odin about the color saturation at the far end. Heimdall replies by looking dignified that rainbows are volunteers, and volunteers do their best when appreciated. The raven approves and steals a breadcrumb with priestly discretion. Asterisk evening begins to gather its tools. The sun lowers itself like a curtain that knows the play by heart. Heimdall walks the length of the bridge with a long-handled brush whose bristles speak fluent twilight. He encouraged the colors to fold themselves into evening versions, softer, more contemplative, less insistent on their individual resumes. He lights the small lanterns set at intervals along the balustrade, each flame trained to mind its own height. They wear little hoods because wind can be vain. He writes the sunset in the ledger using a range of adjectives he keeps specifically for that purpose. Obedient, well-spaced, moderately crimson where appropriate, otherwise respectful. He files the entry under completed ceremonies. The rams return and take up their positions like friendly statues that remember grass. Heimdall rubs their noses and receives, generously, the sound of contented chewing. He oils the hinge of the toll house door until it answers with a polite exhale. He tidies the shelf of unexpected Dusk, which is empty because today has behaved. He sharpens his quill with a knife that has cut only quills and one stubborn loaf. He mends a tear in the felt mat at the threshold with thread, the color of caution, knotting each stitch as if tying tomorrow to the idea of showing up. Supper is stew that has learned its lessons over several hours, accompanied by bread that considers butter a reasonable compromise. Heimdall eats while reading yesterday's minutes from the Council of Weather, which conclude that drizzle is an art form and hail should apply only upon request. He signs his approval with that fence-shaped room. Again, secure boundaries make for kinder afternoons, and sets the paper under a stone warmed by 6 suns earlier in the week. He looks at Jallarhorn, nods to its disciplined silence, and places a fresh cloth over it, less to protect the horn than to protect the evening from feeling obligated. Night finds the bridge practicing humility. Colors tuck themselves away as if into drawers. Stars install themselves at their measured intervals, each keeping an appointment older than ambition. Heimdall stands at the arch's highest point, where the world's breath feels most practiced, and he listens to the day confess its small improvisations. A village has added a new footpath around a puddle that likes to stay. A fisherman has promised to be gentler with his own expectations. A king has learned that patience and policy share a root. A child has decided rocks are worth naming. He files these under improvements and feels the bridge lower its shoulders by a heartbeat. It is the hour when even storytellers nod between words. Heimdall completes his rounds with a lamp that asks nothing of moths. He inspects the far anchorage where the rainbow weds stone and finds it faithful. He taps the metal arch again, hears its proper answer, and allows himself the luxury of approving his own competence. He replaces the lamp on its hook, checks the lock on the cupboard that holds extra, labels for lanes he once had to declare a temporary, chartreuse for emergencies, which please none but offended few, and sets the broom against the wall in a posture of earned rest. What, after all, does a guardian do when there's nothing to guard against? He refines friendly routines until they are excellent company. Heimdall writes one last note in the ledger, a kind of lullaby for filings. All lanes reconciled. See content. Sky considerate. Not a whisper of alarm worthy of brass. The world turned quietly and met itself on schedule. He seals the entry with a small impression of his thumbnail, because signatures should remember they were once hands. He sits on the threshold with the rams, the 3 of them arranged like low hills that take turns being important. He sips the last of the tea that tastes like a green and watches a cloud assembled from leftover day decide which way to become night. If you are still awake, you may be interested to know that Heimdall keeps a tiny collection of lost buttons. He finds them near the bridge where travelers realize that immortality and codes are imperfect colleagues. The buttons are organized by material: bone, horn, wood, optimistic metal, and each has a label with a guess at its story. From a sleeve waved too emphatically, from a tunic outgrown by good fortune, from a cloak that considered flight, from a visitor who learned to carry pins. He intends someday to return each button to its rightful garment, but he is in no hurry. The world loses and finds itself so reliably that the collection feels complete even when it grows. Heimdall's last task is the oldest. He listens for what isn't there. He listens for the crack in time that would welcome endings, and finding none, he assigns the night to itself. He unhooks a bell that rings only in his head, and checks that it is ready to be a bell in everyone's head if it must. It is not heroic, this readiness. It is maintenance. He drinks water that has remembered glaciers politely, and thanks the river for its service. He tells the bridge goodnight in the language of measured footsteps. The bridge, which knows gratitude as well as any god, supports the darkness as carefully as it supports caravans. The watcher sleeps lightly, not because fate demands it, but because he enjoys the feeling of being present. He lies on a bed that smells of cedar and responsibility. Jallarhorn, content on its peg, dreams of being simply a beautiful tube, which is as close as a trumpet gets to vacation. The rams murmur in their ruminations. Somewhere a fox revises its route to avoid waking an old woman with a heroic talent for disapproval. The lanes of the rainbow hold their colors in a thoughtful gray that promises tomorrow. Heimdall closes his eyes, which is an administrative act. His ears continue their work with the relaxed competence of a mill that knows every grain by nickname. And the world, appreciating a watchman who prefers routine to revelation, returns the favor by spinning without incident, which is, in the end, the most impressive miracle. If your thoughts are still strolling, let them step onto the bridge and choose a lane with no urgency. Walk where the stones remember feet, where the arch is confident but never arrogant, where the toll house light glows like a whisper saying yes to order. The dawn will arrive and find everything as it should be. Broom standing, ledger closed, peel of horn unblown, colors waiting under their lids like paints in disciplined jars. Heimdall will rise at the hour that suits him, brush the dew into beads, greet the rams, oil a hinge, and begin to listen again. Nothing will burst or blaze, not today, and likely not tomorrow. And if anything grand must happen one day, he will know before it occurs and will look around, as watchmen do, for where to tidy first. Until then, the bridge rests. The world stays. You may too. You might not think a bench could hold a government, but in the north it often did, and very politely. The longhouse woke with the weather, which is to say it took its time, and the benches along the walls thought about their duties. They stretched from high seat pillar to door, a quiet spine for a village, polished by a century of wool and decisions. Before anyone else stirred, a boy with a broom introduced the floor to the idea of being respectable, and the sit in the rafters rehearsed its lines for later. The benches didn't creak so much as approve. They had learned the art of patient conversation the way trees learn it, by standing still while people tell them everything. A person could doze here and absorb more law than in a library, mostly because the benches kept the minutes in their grain. If you're still awake in a little while, feel free to follow this channel of benches. It will not exactly go anywhere, and that is part of the service. The longhouse had its own climate. Cold entered as a guest and removed its boots. Warmth gathered in bowls and stayed for stories. Smoke took the high places, like a modest chieftain who prefers a balcony. Along the northern wall, the high seat faced the door, as if hospitality liked to keep an eye on arrivals. A carved beast frowned on one armrest, a second beast frowned on the other, and between them sat the idea that order could be comfortable. The rule was simple and endlessly complicated. People would take places according to kin, fame, usefulness, and whether their elbows knew about manners. The benches themselves had opinions about elbows. You could feel it in the way they offered you exactly enough space to behave, and just a finger less than enough to misbehave out in the morning. There were rehearsals for evening, because feasts are small parliaments, and parliaments are large dinners. The steward walked the hall with the seating board. A piece of wood with notches that remembered relatives better than relatives remembered one another. He tapped the board like a metronome for civility. "This notch belongs to Orm," he would say, "because his daughter married into the people who once lent us a roof." The board had a notch for debts repaid and another for debts that preferred to be called favors. There was a notch for the man who always stood in drafts without complaint. There was a smaller notch for the woman who brought salt at the right moments and prevented 3 quarrels a year without being noticed. If benches kept minutes, the seating board kept calendar appointments for gratitude. Outside, the day arranged itself into a sensible sky. Sheep invented new strategies for looking identical. The door stood open to test the air and admit gossip. You could hear the sea reporting that it was still itself and a gull arguing with grammar. On the far bench, by the door where younger people waited to become older, a pile of wooden spoons considered which of them would be chosen for honor. The spoons knew the hierarchy. They had been sat upon. The one with the burn mark from the time the stew announced its boundaries went to a guest who appreciated honesty. The one with the excellent curve, almost lyrical, went to a poet who would compliment it aloud. A broad spoon that could rescue a drowning turnip would go to the man who did not speak often. Because tools enjoy being understood by midday, errands had convinced themselves they were important and came to ask the hall for signatures. A fisherman arrived with news that the shoals had opinions. A woman brought a bolt of homespun for the benches so they could wear clean shirts. A pair of children carried in a bundle of birch bark letters, which is to say firewood, which is to say correspondence with heating. The steward continued to measure people against the seating board. He would tilt his head and consult a memory older than himself. "You," he would say to a traveler who walked like a person with stories edited for time, "belong near the smoke hole, where tailies can escape." To a farmer whose hands looked like respectable plows, "You may sit where the kettle can see you." It remembers gratitude. He spoke to people the way one speaks to chess pieces, acknowledging both their shapes and their destinies without hurrying either. He also measured silence. The longhouse collected silences like other households collect cups, and some were more serviceable than others. The steward placed those silences along the benches the way a gardener places stones in a path to slow the pace pleasantly. Not far from the high seat sat a long, dignified hush, useful for agreements. Near the door, a casual quiet waited like a neighbor leaning over a fence. Between the hearth and the ale casks, there stood a silence that encouraged jokes to take off their boots. On the far bench, an experimental hush practiced being wise. Benches absorb these things. When you sit, your bones recognize the silence under you and adjust accordingly. The way a ship's planks remember which waves are polite. Asterisk, and of course there were the high seat pillars. They were carved with serpents who were sick of being dramatic and had taken up the hobby of looking severe instead. The pillars knew where the ancestors had hidden their best patience. People leaned on them and borrowed a little. A visitor might ask whether the carvings were protective, and the steward would say, "They protect us from forgetting which way to look when we speak." The pillars faced inward, toward the listening, and outward, toward the weather. And that is what protection looked like in Wood Dot by late afternoon. The stew had become serious. A person could stand over it and draw lessons about democracy. The more you stirred, the more everyone tasted the same event, and the fewer carrots tried to declare independence. The benches began to gather heat from the hearth until they were almost opinionated. A serving girl laid claws on the high seat arms, small white flags of truce between authority and gravy. The ale smelled like a conversation that promised to be better than its memory. In the corner, a man tuned a harp to the key of "More Bowls Soon." A dog rehearsed not begging. It sat on its tail as if that were the rule book. When evening stepped through the door like someone remembering a tune, the seating began without a trumpet. People arrived in the order of how much they wanted to be noticed, which is the same as saying they arrived in a human order. The steward, with his board of notches, placed them gently. The chieftain took the high seat, not because he liked being tallest, but because the benches liked having someone to aim at. The old sat where the drafts were polite, the young where their energy would be useful for carrying trays. Poets were placed near people who laughed quietly. Merchants were divided like spices, some near the salt, some near the stories, to keep the evening from tasting like one thing. It all felt choreographed by a calm god of elbows, a peculiar courtesy governed feet. People tucked them under the bench like comments saved for later. If a conversation wandered into complexity, someone's heel would find the rhythm of a sensible march and impress it on the floor. The benches listened and conferred up the grain. Smith sat just far enough from the fire to praise it without proposing improvements. Midwives sat near doors because doors like to be overseen by people who believe in arrivals. On some bench or other, a quiet man with a nicked spoon served as ballast. Everyone felt steadier because his bowl did not slosh. This is the kind of heroism benches appreciate. There were toasts, of course, but even toasts obeyed furniture. The first cup went sunwise because the house liked that direction. The second cup went widdershins, mostly to keep the first from becoming opinionated. The third cup stayed on the table while the earth rotated beneath it, which as a ritual delivers excellent results and takes almost no effort. People spoke when the bench under them agreed with the idea. You could feel the moment arrive, wood warming under a palm, a knot in the board consenting to carry your sentence, and then the words would take the room the way steam takes a lid. Someone praised the harvest without trying to instruct it. Someone thanked the fishermen for mending water into food. Someone complimented the spoon with the lyrical curve and minute dot between toasts. There were those negotiations that keep a small world functioning and a large world from wobbling. A border between fields was patiently moved the width of a boot because boots have more authority than arguments. A marriage proposal was placed like a bowl in the middle of the table, where everyone could reach it and no one would, and then it was agreed upon by the silence that had been reserved earlier for agreements. A dispute about a fence remembered it was really about a tree, and the tree, when asked, preferred to be a tree. The benches accepted all this with the worn dignity of things that have held both laughter and rain. After a while, the hall settled into that excellent stillness that is not the lack of noise, but the presence of digestion. The stew told its story repeatedly and was applauded with spoons. The harper played in a key that encouraged bowls to be brave. People took turns saying something almost wise and then correcting themselves, which is the most reliable method for capturing wisdom and keeping it comfortable. A visiting trader offered a small chest of glass beads that looked interested in continuing to exist. It was passed from hand to hand and decided to become a necklace for the longhouse itself. Hung near the door where guests could admire the good taste of wood. Along the benches, micro-governments formed. 3 farmers proposed a cooperative plan for borrowing 1 ladder. 2 grandmothers outlawed drafts. A group of cousins ratified an expedition to the river that included rules about boots, mud, and not telling adults what they didn't need to know. The dog passed a bill requiring fallen scraps to be considered citizens of the floor, swiftly naturalized. In a corner, an uncle explained to a wide-eyed nephew the classification of smoke, the kind that tells stories, the kind that remembers fish, and the kind that goes home early because it has a meeting in the morning. The nephew accepted this and became taller by a small amount. Somewhere in the cheerful brown of the evening, a skald rose, as skalds do with a poem that had been sanded smooth by retellings. It offered a saga in which very little happened for a sensible length of time. This old tale concerned a lost ring that wasn't lost, and a ship that decided the best way to avoid a storm was to walk home around the fjord. The hero's great achievement was being where he was supposed to be at the hour agreed upon. People nodded. One man slept with dignity, and the poem tucked itself around him like a blanket. The benches listened and added a thin coat of agreement to their surfaces. Refills came, and went with careful choreography that prevented both drought and flood. The ale was served by the woman with a memory better than the moon's. She knew which cup had tampered with a good mood, and which cup had patched one. She moved like a person who explained the calendar to time itself and received thanks in the language of empty bowls. On the yellow bench closest to the hearth, someone discussed the etiquette of borrowing a horse that knows it's being borrowed. The horse's opinion, they agreed, counted for 2 votes. On the blue bench at the far end, a man described how to count stars so that your heart doesn't get involved. The hall let this advice drift upward and make friends with the smoke. There was, as always, a subtle relocation of people as the evening aged. Space opened by the door for a traveler too late for stew and exactly on time for friendliness. A seat near the high chair was ceded to a woman whose hand shook slightly but who poured without spilling a talent the house admired. The steward adjusted the seating board in his mind the way a sailor trims a sail. A little for comfort, a little for speed, a little because he knew what the wind would do later. He flicked a crumb from the high seat arm, which counts as policy. And so it went, a river of uncomplicated navigation, until the hour when logs are smaller than their shadows. The heart breasted. The stew congratulated itself on being empty. Bowls were stacked in the archaeological record of a good night. The dog decided to forgive everyone. The door thought about closing and then did so in a way that meant tomorrow. The benches creaked, finally, not from strain, but from a sense that they were being trusted again with sleeping people. A man half sang a lullaby to a spoon. The spoon, flattered, reflected a candle with flattering devotion. When the hall was ready for its night, people slid along the benches to make room for dreams. One by one, talk sank into the floor alongside the day's footprints. A last quiet decision was made about sails that would leave at dawn if the dawn remembered to happen. Someone stoked the fire to the polite glow that reassures rafters. The steward hung the seating board on its peg. Tomorrow it would become a map again, but now it resembled a piece of wood at peace with having been useful. Outside, the weather confirmed it would take care of itself. Frost penciled the world with a steady hand. The sea tested its hinges and found them appropriately squeaky. A star took an attendance count and allowed absences with good excuses. In the loft, a few sleepers breathed at the same tempo, which made the longhouse feel like a well-tuned boat. The benches held all of it names, agreements, jokes, the silent consensus about which side of the house preferred the moon and did not mind the wait. They had seen very important people in very small cups and had discovered, to their satisfaction, that both occupy roughly the same amount of space when seated. The night lengthened in that northern way that is partly geography and partly habit. The high seat pillars listened outward and inward. The dog snored like a respectful saw. An ember blinked at the spoon with a lyrical curve, and the spoon pretended to be a quiet moon. The floor announced, in its faint wooden voice, that it had decided to hold everything exactly where it was until morning, including hopes that liked to wander. You could almost hear the benches approving again, that same gentle sound they make when wool slides onto them and stays. If you are still here, drifting on the idea that furniture can keep a village balanced, you might be amused by the truly minor rule about belts. Those who wore them with a buckle far to the side sat on the west bench by custom, where buckles could be admired without strategy. Those who wore belts with the buckle centered were distributed evenly to avoid symmetrical debates. And those who wore rope instead of leather sat where the rope would not scandalize the cat, which is a real category if you ask any longhouse. No one remembered why the rule began, but the benches did, and they liked it. Benches, when offered a tradition, are very good at holding it until its reasons return. Eventually, even the steward slept, and his dreams placed people gently in the order described by the notches. The longhouse exhaled and expanded a fraction, just enough to fit the night. Under the high seat, an old coin listened for footsteps that would happen tomorrow and made an early recording. In the ash, someone had drawn a tiny map to nowhere in particular, and the ember traced it twice to ensure that nowhere would still know how to be found in the morning. The benches understood all of this as they understand elbows and patience and the art of arranging people so that more happens by accident than on purpose toward dawn. The cold loosened its shoulders and decided to be glass in certain places. A rooster composed himself into the idea of being helpful. The sea rehearsed a polite yes for the day's request. The door gathered itself to open, and the benches, who had supported feasts and laws and naps, took a private pride in being the kind of furniture that does not demand attention but quietly prevents catastrophe by reminding everyone where to sit. When morning finally arranged its light on the floor like folded linen, the first footsteps returned, the broom reintroduced the hall to respectability, and the seating board blinked awake on its peg. The longhouse was ready to hold a government again, one made of bowls and listening, and the precise distribution of elbows. You can rest here with them if you like. Nothing is urgent. Even decisions, when properly seated, are a form of sleep. You wouldn't expect a piece of wood to keep better time than a bell, but in the north, there was such a stick that did its job quietly and never once complained. It lived above the door like a patient ruler, a yard of days with little notches that could explain winter to a person half asleep. The year stick, the primstaff, had one edge for summer and one edge for winter, because the sky enjoys being organized, and because people like to know which edge their boots belong to. Each mark was a small whisper here, a tiny fish for the first nut to feel brave. There, a twig for the day the woods admitted they were going to be green again. Early in the morning, someone lifted the stick down the way you might lift a cat that respects you, and looked along its teeth until the present day stopped hiding. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe to the stick. It posts one update per sunrise and never loses your place. The year stick wasn't flashy. It had learned the art of authority from fences and spoons. There was a hole at one end for hanging, and a shine along the side where fingers had gone to think. On certain mornings, the light found it first and ran down it like a little ship gliding along a coastline of chores. Next to the door, someone had scratched a line with a knife that had also been a potato peeler and a letter opener. The line pointed to the notch that was today. You could see, if you breathed in evenly and didn't startle the dust, a story told in symbols. A comb meant sheep remembered who they were. A cross meant folks might wash before supper. A rake meant hay had opinions. A fox meant someone ought to be clever without making a show of it. It was all very practical, like poetry that has learned how to stack firewood. There was a rule about how long you could look at the stick before breakfast. The rule was not written. It was held in trust by the porridge, which didn't want to go cold while you counted saints. So people counted quickly. They slid a finger along the edge and named what needed naming in an undertone that was almost humming. They checked where winter would end, because that's a pleasant sport even in summer. They traced last year's knife marks and remembered who had trimmed which notch because he had a steadier hand, and who had added the extra little curl on the day with the bear because she liked bears in a respectful, theoretical way. The stick had become a family member who did not borrow money. It sat quietly and yet somehow remembered everything that required patience. Outside, the weather practice being the subject for later, Frost considered the window in a way that meant nearly. A thin wind arranged the shore like chess pieces and then forgot the rules. In the byre, a cow rehearsed her lines for the day. I am a cow. I have opinions about hay. Each time the door swung, The year stick wobbled on its peg and corrected itself with dignity. It didn't mind the drafts. Drafts are how a building takes a deep breath. From the bed closet, a sleepy child asked what day this was in the language of children, which is half question and half blanket. The answer came as it always did. Today is the day with the small ship, which means the first safe row out to check traps. And the stew will not object to a fish if a fish does. Not object to being stewed at. People trusted the stick because it never tried to be exciting. Excitement is often inaccurate at scale. The primstaff offered soft promises like a calendar that sighs. It would tell you that the day of the raven had arrived, which meant in this valley one should watch the sky for two birds that miscommunicate perfectly. It would remind you about the day when you hang a small bundle of herbs above the door and feel privately triumphant for the rest of the week. On the winter edge, a simple star meant that darkness had stopped expanding like an ambitious cat and begun to be modest again. There was a notch for the day the ice should be thick, enough to trust, and another for the day you sit on the shore and remember that trusting is sometimes a hobby. Later in the morning, the stick made the rounds of the house without moving. People consulted it the way sailors consult the line where sea becomes sky, not to be surprised, just to be confirmed. If a visitor arrived, the first thing after the handshake was to nod toward the stick, as if to say, "We are governed, but by something wooden." Visitors enjoyed guessing the symbols. "This little shovel?" one would ask. "Graves." "No, turnips," said the host, and they both agreed the two concepts were neighbors. "And this?" "A shoe. It means someone will visit with good news." "Always?" "Eventually." It soothed everyone to propose such similes. The stick didn't argue. It liked being a stage for competent guessing. Sometimes the marks became deeply specific in an almost comedic way. A bird with a slightly surprised expression meant that last year, on that day, a goose had forgotten how to be a goose and had to be politely reminded. Two small waves meant the fjord would pretend to be the sea. A very small sun meant the sun would pretend to be a coin and slip from your pocket behind a cloud, just for fun. On the summer edge, a little triangle meant roof mending, which is the sport of hanging on to a slanted world while holding a hammer that thinks it's a philosopher. On the winter edge, a narrow flask cut into the wood remembered the day of medicinal spirits, when ailments were persuaded to leave by tactful arguments and a little heat. There was also a knot that simply meant stay kind. Asterisk around midday, the year stick took a nap while work performed its duties. But even in sleep, it kept time. People worked in soft orbit around what it implied. Near the path, two neighbors met with their arms full of fence and discussed whether this was the right week to stop pretending the fence would mend itself. The answer, according to the stick and common sense, was yes, but not in a hurry. The afternoon was long and pleasant, like a well-told rumor, the kind that never actually arrives but is said to be on its way. While people picked, mended, salted, or stirred, they hummed the symbols under their breath. Little ship, small rake, fox, herbs, belt, star. Even the dog learned the order and would thump its tail on the floor when the day of scraps approached, which is not superstition so much as literacy. By the time the sun began to leak gently toward the hills, the stick became social again. It came down from its peg and lay along the table like a guest of honor. The table gave it room. It is never wise to crowd a calendar. A knife stood by, friendly. The children took turns running their fingers along the cuts and naming what their grandparents named, because memory is best learned by touching. No one rushed. The stick encouraged the fine habit of doing a thing once and correctly, like wrapping line on a pin or counting sheep that have already introduced themselves. In the corner, the big pot held steam in a way that welcomed stories. When a symbol needed a repair, the oldest person took the knife, breathed, and made the missing curve with such care that the curve felt appreciated and planned to behave for another year. At supper, the day's symbol became a topic rather than an instruction. The small ship meant a fish had indeed remembered to be hungry, and a stew had remembered to be patient, and a family had remembered how spoons are just boats with a single purpose. Do you recall, someone asked, the year the small ship was larger? Everyone nodded. A winter so long the ship had seemed very important, like a door in a wall. That was also the year the fox was carved looking left instead of right. No one agreed on why, but it made people kinder to each other, which is a decent outcome for a fox. The Primstoff allowed these gentle arguments, the way a harbor allows boats to brag about tide, during the washing up an ancient ritual involving water, consolation, and a towel with strongly held beliefs. The stick returned to its nail to supervise the evening. The last light picked out the narrow cross for a long-ago promise that had calmed a quarrel. A little bag cut into the wood meant the market 2 valleys over, where salt and gossip were measured in the same unit. A coiled rope symbol stood in for rest, although everyone knew ropes only truly rest when they are used. On the winter side, a notch with a tiny cut beside it meant, "Do not forget the hinge this time," which had been carved in a tone of voice that still lightly embarrassed the house. People smiled up at the wood and forgave their former selves for once having a door that insisted on commentary. Later, when the room became mostly fire and the wind politely checked the eaves for leaks, the stick turned philosophical, as much as a stick is permitted. Someone asked whether the symbols were older than the people, or the people older than the symbols, and the year stick made the same reply it always made, a rich line of carved patience. Another person proposed that the summer edge and winter edge must be rivals. The stick, unbothered, offered the measured objection that a board is one thing with 2 agreeable sides. The children tried counting forward to the next festival and fell asleep around the number 5, which is a respectable number to fall asleep on. The cat used the Primstoff's shadow to hunt the Primstoff's shadow, an activity known to science as being a cat. Small customs kept arriving to sit by the fire. On the day with the 2 leaves, the family always drank stronger tea. On the day with the small antler, the shoes were brushed, whether or not they had done anything to deserve it. On the day with the cup, everyone pretended to forget someone's birthday and then conveniently remembered it with cake. Each custom hung in the room like a low star, the sort of star that knows your name and asks nothing except that you keep being the same person with slight improvements. The stick approved. You can tell when a piece of wood approves. It stops trying to be straight and becomes exactly straight enough, almost every year after the first frost. Someone would take the knife and add a new symbol to mark something that hadn't known it was traditional yet. A tiny sprig for the day, a child pointed out where the wind kept its nest. A little bowl for the evening, everyone ate in the loft because the floor had temporarily become a small river. A careful wheel because an elderly cart had decided to retire with honors. Carving a new mark was never hurried. It took as long as it took to be respectful, which turned out to be the same amount of time as a candle becoming slightly shorter. When the line finally touched wood and stayed, a future existed there, quietly, without theatrics. If there was any magic, it lived in the moments when the present day met a notch cut by someone whose hands now belonged to the earth. Fingers would trace the old line and feel a pressure of agreement from the past. The stick had a way of telling you that you were not the first or the last to misplace a hinge, invent a pie, or stoop in gratitude because the hay remembered to be dry. People found themselves calming down in its vicinity. Even disagreements preferred to be sensible when the year stick was listening. It's difficult to shout at a calendar that has patiently outlived 4 roofs and a geopolitical experiment. By the hour when words shorten and cups discover the wisdom of being empty. The prim staff became a good pillow for thoughts. Someone held it across their knees and let the grain lead the mind like a thoughtful track through snow. Plans were made with a pencil of steam. Here we will mend the net. There we will respect the weather. In between we will permit ourselves to sit. The dog, who understood many human things and ignored the others politely, rested its chin on the winter edge, which meant something that did not require translation. If you stood at the door and looked back, the stick above its peg looked not like a keeper of time, but like a small bridge. A bridge between last year and the next, between habit and kindness. Outside, in the very late, the northern sky practiced being enormous and got it right again. Stars appeared in batches like thoughtful buttons. The fjord breathed. A fox wrote a brief letter to the dark in very neat cursive and signed it with silence. Inside, the year stick held the house steady by remembering when all the little things should happen, so the big things did not need to. It did not promise weather. It promised preparedness, which is better because it cannot be wrong. The knife slept, proud of having done little harm. The peg leaned one way and then the other in time with the wind. The peg loved its career. People drifted to their beds at a civilized slowness that would have impressed kings if kings had any sense of pace. The last person in the room, whose footsteps were expert at being quiet, stood and looked up at the stick for a while, the way sailors look at a compass, and then felt better for reasons that would be easy to explain to an oak. Tomorrow's notch was there, already the right size. Nothing in it hurried. The house relaxed as if someone had loosened a belt around its waist. A coal in the hearth considered becoming a story and postponed the decision. Toward dawn, the prim staff felt the room lighten the way a lake feels oars before they enter. It liked mornings. Mornings make small promises and keep most of them. When the door opened, the stick watched the day arrive like a well-behaved guest, and the first finger of the household traced the present with the same competent tenderness as ever. There would be chores in coordinates, cups in context, laughter in its scheduled place, and also the allowed anomalies that keep a world interesting. Somewhere on the summer edge, a future notch waited for a tiny new reason to exist. The stick made space for it the way a bench makes space for a friend. The child in the bed closet asked the daily question. The answer came easily. It was the day with the little hand that looks like a comb. Sheep would be consulted. The kettle would agree. The sky, which had been unfailingly present so far, would attend again. And the wooden calendar, calm as a readable river, would keep counting in place, turning the irregularities of life into a line of friendly marks that could be followed in the dark by touch alone, which is sometimes all the light anyone needs.